Hello, church. Welcome to this week's message. My name is Henry Loke. This is God's Feeding Station. Honored again to be with you this week, and I want to thank you for being here and taking some time out of your busy weeks and busy schedules to go through God's Word with me. It's nice to be here, and it's good to be back in the book of Romans after a couple of weeks off. We were, as I said, we were on traveling back to see family, but we're back in the swing, and we're back in Romans, and today it's Romans 19 through 23. To recap a little bit, because verse 18 really goes with this section, but there was so much to cover about the wrath of God. We spent all last week on that, and if you haven't seen that yet, I would suggest going back and seeing and listening to that sermon before you get into this one. To recap, though, a little bit, we talked about how moral order is the wrath of God at work, and that God has designed His creation to work in a specific way. And if we work against that, if we go against God's natural machinations, right? God's natural workings of how creation works. If we go against that, we go against God, we do so at our own peril, because the wages of sin is death. If we go against God's order, we're having our way over God's way. And so that is sin, and that is worthy of death. Bible lays that out very simply. And so what is one to do, right? What are we supposed to do? We have a sinful nature. We cannot atone for our sins. We can apologize, and we can repent and turn away from our sin, but we are sinful people, and we are going to slip up from time to time. How are we to atone for our own sin? How are we to save ourselves from the wrath of God? Well, the bottom line is we can't. Bottom line is we can't. And so we seem to be stuck in this vicious cycle. Well, here comes God with a plan. And again, I've said this like 100 times already over the past year and a half. God has taken this into account, and He has a plan. And out of His grace and His mercy and His love for us, He sends His Son, right? He reaches down from heaven, pulls us up out of the quagmire that is our sin and the consequences of it, and He lays all of that on His Son. He sends His Son, and He lays all of those consequences and all that responsibility for answering for our sin on Jesus. And the important thing is, too, to remember that Jesus takes all of our sin on Himself willingly. He's not forced to do it. It's assigned to Him to do it. But as we know from the garden, there was a struggle there. And I do think Jesus, in His humanness, had a choice. He could have refused, but He didn't. And He took it on Himself willingly. And so we are pulled out of the muck and mire of our sin and saved from ourselves by God's great plan of salvation. Right? God inserts Himself into the chaos and says, I got a fix for this. So let's read chapters 19 through 23 into the message today. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they're without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, and birds, and animals, and creeping things. Now, one thing we have to remember is, while God can be known, He cannot be fully understood in our sinful states. Job talks about this in Job 11. He says, can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? It is higher than heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. Right? The finite, which is us, cannot fully understand the infinite. But, it's a big but. There is a way for us to know what we need to know. There is a way for us to understand as much of God as is necessary and to know his plan of salvation for us. God himself has shown us what we need to know. We have his word, obviously, but the other big thing is we have creation around us. And I believe we have this imprint on our nature, in our nature, on our hearts. We have this imprint of the knowledge of God within us because he is the one who created us. You get these things that say, they're stamped, made in Japan, made in China, a lot made in China these days, made in the USA, right? We are made by God. That stamp, made by God, is somewhere in our nature, on our hearts, on our souls. And so we have this innate knowledge of him. What we do with that knowledge is obviously up to us. We can choose to acknowledge that, or we can choose to ignore it. But that imprint on our being constantly calls to us, constantly pokes at us until we make a choice, I think. And, we can sever it and not be bothered by it again, or we can choose to acknowledge it. God says in Jeremiah 1:5, and this is where this, made by God comes from. He says, he's talking to Jeremiah, and he says to him, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. So God has knowledge of us, from what it says in Jeremiah, before we're even formed in the womb. We're in God's plan. We're not an afterthought. We're not a mistake. We're not a whoops. Right? Our existence is intentional. And so when it comes to judging lives, per se, and judging is a tough word because we're not supposed to judge, right? But when it comes to like the measure of a man, let's put it that way, right? You can always tell something of someone's life by the fruit in their lives, by what they produce in their lives, right? Their family, how hard they work, right? Those types of things. So we can tell something about God by the world he created, right? Because even in Eden, God was proving his existence to Adam and Eve by their sheer presence in the garden, right? The variety, the multitude, the order, the beauty, the harmony, right? How things in nature and in God's creation work together proves that there is a creator. I mean, think about the human body. Think about conception. Think about how babies are conceived. Two cells joined together, and they contain all the information necessary to develop and form a human being. It's amazing when you think about it. It's amazing how the human body works in conjunction with one another. How the brain works with me moving my arms and my mouth, and my mind's working at the same time. I mean, drumming's a really interesting thing for me because, and if I'm singing at the same time, it's like four limbs are working at the same time. My brain's working to remember lyrics, and my voice is working to sing and be on pitch and all these things. It's amazing how the body works. So it's not just things in nature, what we call, nature, trees and mountains and rivers and all that kind of stuff. The human body in and of itself is proof that there is a creator, that there is a God. I mean, the body, when it's in balance, can even heal itself of certain things. So it's just an amazing thing. And so it proves that there is an eternal, all-powerful God. Tertullian, who was one of the old Christian fathers of the day, said, it was not the pen of Moses that initiated the knowledge of the Creator. The vast majority of mankind, though they had never heard the name Moses, to say nothing of his book, know the God of Moses nonetheless. Nature is the teacher. The soul is the pupil. Now, there are those who are going to argue this, and my buddy Paul Ernst here is going to know exactly where I'm going here. There are those who are going to argue this. There are those who are going to say this all happened by chance, right? Those are Darwinists, and they believe that all of this was just a roll of the dice, It all kind of happened by chance, and now it's just survival of the fittest. And I'm probably oversimplifying things a little bit here. I don't know a lot about Darwinism, and I don't care to, because I know enough about it to know that I don't believe in what it proposes. And our friend here at the Phoenix Station, Dr. Doug Grodice, in his book Christian Apologetics, addresses this, and he tells us that Darwinists are philosophically committed to naturalism, which is materialism, right? The natural world is all that's allowed to be studied. And the natural world is the only thing that can provide answers to scientific questions, right? This is what Darwinism is about. Everything that Darwinists do is based on the material state of everything, right? There's nothing spiritual. There's nothing supernatural. So all their scientific exploration bases itself on materialism. And so only natural explanations are allowed, and only materialistic explanations can be cited as scientific. That's it. And so C.K. Chesterton, I can't talk today. C.K. Chesterton said this: "The Christian is quite free to believe that there is a considerable amount of settled order of inevitable development in the universe. But the materialist is not allowed to admit into his spotless machine the slightest speck of spiritualism or miracle." It's kind of a bummer way to live your life, isn't it? Just to limit yourself to what nature gives, and to believe that what nature gives is all by chance and it's survival of the fittest. In Lee Strobel's book, Case for Christ, he has an interesting conversation with a gentleman named Dr. Walter Bradley. And Dr. Bradley addresses some of this in his conversation with Lee. He says, look, and this is addressing this whole, all of the origins of life being boiled down to just chance, that this all just happened by accident. This is what Dr. Bradley had to say. He said, look, if you take all the carbon in the universe, put it on the earth, let it chemically react at the fastest rate possible, and then leave it for 1 billion years, the odds of creating just one functional protein molecule is 1 in 10 with 60 zeros behind that. 1 in 10 with 60 zeros behind that 10. Those are the odds of something like this, like God's creation happening by chance, right? One protein molecule forming, 1 in 10 with 60 zeros behind it. Sir Frederick Hoyle said it would be as likely as a tornado moving through a junkyard and then accidentally assembling a fully functional Boeing 747. Those are the odds we're talking about here. Now, there's all kind of other things that people want to attribute creation to, and we don't have time to talk about all of them. Chemical affinity, self-ordering. This one made me laugh. Seeding from space. That's a really interesting one, where some alien culture, whatever, planted seeds in a rocket and sent it here, and that's the origin of life. That's a really interesting one. They talk about vents in the ocean, all kind of different things that we don't have time to talk about. But in all this study that's gone on over the years, and this is going to date me a little bit, but in 1999, at a conference on the origins of life, a fellow named Klaus Doss said this. He said, more than 30 years of experimentation on the origin of life in the fields of chemical and molecular evolution have led to a better perception of the immensity of the problem of the origin of life on Earth rather than to its solution. At present, all discussions on principal theories and experiments in the field either end in stalemate or in a confession of ignorance. Well, yeah, if you discount the possibility of an intelligent designer, well, then yeah, you would come to a stalemate. And you would come to confession of ignorance because there is no other option here. When you take in all of the evidence, just have a look around and you look at how things work, it's obvious to a lot of us that there is a purpose behind this. Now, Bradley, in his conversation with Strobel, says something really interesting here. He says, look, when we see writing, right, or written information, right, whether it's on a cave wall, prehistoric painting, or it's a book we order from Amazon, or it's a magazine we read, or something we read on the internet, right, we assume that there's intelligence behind it, right? It's a logical assumption, right? The brain, a person had an idea, and thus he painted the picture or he wrote something down. There's intelligence behind it. So if that's the case, then why isn't that true for nature itself? Right? In other words, take DNA, and this is the crux of the issue here. Inside the DNA of every cell in every living creature is written information. Right? So in English, we have the 26-letter alphabet, which we use to form words and paragraphs and sentences, right? All those types of things. We use the alphabet to communicate. In DNA, it's a 4-letter chemical alphabet that combines in various sequences to form words and sentences and paragraphs which instruct cells on how to behave and how to function in order to make proteins which are essential for life. Right? So it works just like our alphabet works. And each cell in the human body now contains more information than all 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Each cell, one cell, contains more information in 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. So, is it not reasonable then to infer that this isn't random? This isn't a random product of unguided nature. Right? When we see a written language, based on our experience, we conclude intelligence behind it. There's an intelligent cause behind it. So based on that, then we can conclude reasonably that the information sequences contained in DNA also have an intelligent cause behind it. So then that means life on Earth comes from a who rather than from a what. So we cannot plead ignorance. We have no excuse here. All the evidence points to intelligent design here. I mean, look how the world works. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning of the message today. When you go against God's order of things, it's usually chaos and at worst catastrophe. Right? Break the laws of agriculture, what happens? Your crops fail. Break the laws of architecture, and unfortunately we just had a very unfortunate example of this in Florida, right? Break the laws of architecture, what happens? Your building collapses. Break the laws of health, your body suffers, right? Paul is saying, look around you. Understand how things work. There's an order to creation, and someone had to establish that order. Right? And even understanding this, even when people come to grips with this, what do they do with it? Right? How did the people in Paul's time, and how do we now react to this? Because you cannot look around and not come to the understanding that there's an order to creation here. There is a specific way things work. And again, when you look at how humans interact with God's creation, and when we try to subjugate that to our needs and wants and desires, what happens? You get things like, the big oil rig explosion that happened in the last 10 years in the Gulf of Mexico. And there was just something that was going on. There was this big ring of fire in the ocean. I forget what happened. But you look at what happens when we mess with the way God has designed things. Right? And even when we come to grips with it, what do we do with it? How do we respond? We may acknowledge God in creation, but our worship and our honor of him and our awe of God does not always match our knowledge of him. Right? Because to glorify God means to glorify him and him only. And that's not what we do. We spread the wealth, man. We spread the wealth, don't we? We want to honor everything. We want to honor Mother Earth, right? We want to honor the creation rather than the Creator. We want to honor ourselves. We want to honor others. We want to look to the stars and the sun and the moon to guide us on our path instead of God, right? Horoscopes. Freudian slip. I said horoscopes, right? But horror scopes is what they are because they're false. There's no intelligence behind them, right? Right? We put up little Buddhas in our yards, and we even worship the mother of Jesus, as we shouldn't. And I know that's going to aggravate my Catholic friends, but sorry, it has to be said. We even create things in the image of God when we are told specifically in Deuteronomy not to do it. Deuteronomy 4:15. Therefore, watch yourselves carefully, since you saw no form on the day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire. Beware, lest you act corruptly by making a carved image for yourselves in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the air, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water under the earth. And beware, lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the hosts of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them. Things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. We make images that represent God, or we make images and make false gods out of them, and we worship them. There's great scripture, I believe it's in Isaiah, where he says, I'm way paraphrasing here, but he's like, are you kidding me? You're going to take like a tree trunk, and you're going to take a big log of wood, and you're going to use some of it for this, and some of it for that, and some of this for cooking, and some of it for warmth, and then you're going to carve a god out of what's left, and you're going to worship that? Makes no sense. Makes no sense. And God lays it out very specifically here. Don't do this. And don't make images that represent him. But yet here we are. Walk into some churches and realize what's happening. So we need to be careful not to excuse things that we think are harmless when they are an affront to God, because this life we live in creation, it's given to us from him as a gift, right? Every day, every breath is a gift from him, and it needs to be recognized as such. And too often, I take it for granted. And too often, I get so bogged down by my situation, my circumstances, whatever that may be, and I forget to be joyful, and I forget to give thanks to God for just opening my eyes and taking a breath in the morning, for being able to get out of bed in the morning. But every day, every hour, every second is a gift and should be treated as such. Now, Paul says they became fools. How did they become fools? Why did they become fools? Why do we become fools? Well, we become fools when we think we know better than God. It's the bottom line, right? when we make our ideas, our speculations, our opinions the standard of living over God's will. When we make the world the master of our lives, and when our own opinions and the opinions of others matter more to us than the word or the will of God, then we're self-centered rather than God-centered. And we fall into idolatry. Right? We are honoring ourselves, we're honoring others, we're honoring the world and the worldly things other than honoring God. And that's foolish. That's foolish. We have no idea what the future holds. We don't have the power. We don't have the intelligence. We don't have the foresight to know I have no idea what's going to happen in the next minute in this message, let alone what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day or the next. But God does. We look at time in a linear fashion. God looks down, sees the whole picture all at once. And so why do we think we know what's best when we can't see, 2 inches in front of our own nose? And God sees the whole picture. Why would we not turn to him and rely on his advice for us in our lives? Right? That's foolish, and it's selfish, and it's sinful. We enter into idolatry because we want our will over God's will. It's that simple. And that's the essence of sin, right? Putting ourselves in the place of God. Now, God's creation manifests his deity. It makes clear to us that he is indeed the immortal God that the Bible talks about. But we exchange that knowledge for the foolishness of the ways of the world, right? We reject the infinite for the finite. We reject the reality of heaven, and we embrace the earthly. We embrace the temporary. And what does the Bible say we're supposed to do? Where are we supposed to store our treasure? Work for treasures in heaven, the word says. Do not store treasures here on earth where moth and rust will eat away at it. Store it in heaven where it's guarded and where it will be kept safe and where it's true treasure and everlasting treasure. Idolatry of self takes many forms, and we know that, right? We've talked about this in various forms over the past year and a half, right? It can be wealth, it can be materialistic, it can be self, it can be family. I mean, think of Abraham and Isaac. I go back to, I think that's the whole purpose of him asking Isaac to sacrifice, him asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac so that Abraham would get his priorities in order. God would help Abraham get his priorities straight. And sometimes that's what we have to do. Well, not sometimes, all the time. We have to take all those things that are important to us and lay them on the altar of God. Because as Abraham laid Isaac on the altar and was willing to give it to God, to be used by God, give him to God, to be used by God as he saw fit, what did God do? Once Abraham surrendered his son, the most important thing at that point in his life to him, what did God do? God rewarded Abraham and gave it back to him. But not until Abraham had his priorities straight. And that's the key. And sometimes I find that I've got to strap myself to the horns of the altar. Because it's me who's the most important thing in my life. Whether it's my health, my security, my whatever, my happiness, my joy, whatever that may be. Sometimes I have to put myself on the altar and say, God, it's got to be your will, man. It's got to be your will. Because I can't do this anymore. I'm failing at doing this, and I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be in control because I'm failing at it miserably. And that's okay. That's okay. Because that's the way out, right? That's the way out. Because Matthew Henry says, look, it was the greatest honor God did to man that he made man in the image of God. But it is the greatest dishonor man has done to God that he has made God in the image of man. And that's what I do. I make God in my image because I want what I want. But see, the way out and the way to fix this is to own it. It's to own it. To recognize this is what I'm doing. To recognize, to go outside and go, wow, man, look at this creation that God has given me. Look at what God has given us. And look at how he has blessed us with this magnificent creation of his. And then I have to own that, yeah, you know what, God, I've been taking it for granted. And I haven't been giving you credit. And I haven't been worshiping you like I should. And I haven't been honoring you. And I haven't been following your will. And I haven't been glorifying you. And I haven't been loving as I should be. And I haven't been putting you first. And you know what, God? I got to put myself on the altar. I got to sacrifice myself and turn it all over to you. And that's the beginning of rectifying the problem. What's the saying? You can't fix a problem till you admit that you got one. Well, sometimes we have one. And sometimes it's just taking God for granted. So all of creation speaks about God. We become foolish when we try to use it for our own means. And we use it to glorify ourselves, to make ourselves, more important than we really are. And when we refuse to give honor and glory to God, to credit God with it, and to give it all back to him, because that's the other piece of this. Everything that we have, right? Everything that we have. I mean, this house and the iPad that's recording this and the computer that's recording the audio, all of this is a gift from God to be used for his will and his purposes. So we need to give it all back to him. We need to stop being foolish. We need to recognize who God is, and then with that knowledge, honor him and him only. That's the key. That's how we get out of this. We're not stuck in it. There's a way out. Own it and keep it simple. Don't make it complicated, because it is simple. God is God, and he is the creator of the universe. Recognize him, honor him, love him, glorify him, follow him, submit to him. That's what he wants. And watch how your life flourishes.